Hey folks, Mike Dadkak with you. I want you to head over to marketplace.drstellamd.com. That's marketplace.drstellamd.com. That's where you can find all the health and wellness products you need to make sure you're prepared for whatever comes next. She's got Vax detox bundles, pandemic preparedness kits, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine supplies. You can sign up for a telehealth session and get the care you need from a doctor who's been telling us the truth about health and wellness and COVID from the very beginning. Head on over to marketplace.drstellamd.com. Use promo code ITN as Dr. Stella, who's a friend of the show and a friend to freedom loving patriots everywhere, has agreed to give ITN viewers a generous discount. Take care of yourselves and your families by going to marketplace.drstellamd.com and getting the supplies you need to remain prepared. Tell them Mike sent you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are with Shaz Khan, author of The Ultimate Vaccine Timeline. Shaz, we were just talking before we came online here. I think timelines are critical to understanding the times that we are living in. Right off the top here, what do you think is the biggest revelation your research has shown about the vaccine industry in this country, in your country, and the entire world?
Well, thank you, Mike, so much for having me. So there are quite a few things that shocked me and were surprising. I think one of the main one was that the government authorities have basically buried a lot of documents about vaccine injuries since at least the 1940s, which is probably the earliest documents that I could find in the Swiss archives. And then particularly in the 1970s, which were the archives that I undug from the National Archives in the UK, where that was the whole time when there was the pertussis scare. Remember when a lot of people were concerned about the DTP shot at the time, mainly because of the pertussis component, which doesn't exist alone. It only exists in triple shot. And basically the government authorities in paper, behind closed doors, admit to things like screaming to fits as being a sign of brain damage, but then edit that down so that the public isn't informed of that. And again, behind the public, they'll admit to a very much higher rate of severe injury and death acknowledged, but won't communicate that to the public. And that was actually one of my motivations to actually putting this in a book, because I never intended with the research to actually write a book. It was just for my own curiosity to find out how safe vaccines actually were and what the historical document said about this.
Well, you have some experience in your immediate family with vaccines, and that's what kind of led you to take this on. Is that true?
Well, yes, I'm not a parent. I'm not a scientific professional or doctor, so vaccines weren't really on my radar at the time. But in 2015,
that only means you can be trusted.
and I have nothing to lose. Like, I have no reputation they can
Right.
attack me for. When you see they attack people with double PhDs and with clinical experience for 40 years, I'm like, well, because anyway.
I've had it.
But yeah,
Right. Exactly.
in 2015, my father passed away about 2 months after a flu shot. And that just got me asking questions, because he wasn't a smoker. He was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, but all his symptoms were neurological. And it just didn't make sense to me. So the first thing I did when I found out he took a flu shot was go and read the package insert for the flu shot, because I didn't know which one he got exactly. I read pretty much all of them and was quite shocked to discover that they all indicate neurological side effects as, being relatively, they don't even say very rare. It's rare, but rare is not as rare as we like to think it is. It's not one in a million at all. It can be up to 1 in 1,000 is what the manufacturers actually consider rare. So that basically shocked me, and I embarked on basically a journey to understanding more about vaccines. I also had a very good friend of mine who was pregnant with her first baby at that time, and obviously vaccines were on the radar for her. So this basically what started a 10-year research deep dive, which I never expected I would do, and I certainly never expected to write a book, but I thought it would be important, because with all the books that there are on vaccines on the market, there was nothing apart from Dissolving Illusions by Dr. Suzanne Humphries and Roman Bystrianyk. There was nothing that really delved into the history, and certainly nothing that really presented all the facts in a timeline fashion. There are a couple of websites that were pretty good and they had some information, but they still weren't complete. And I saw a lot of them have evolved during the time that I've actually written this book. So there are more available now, but still it doesn't really cover the information that you find in the National Archives and in the historical medical records.
Well, we're sorry to hear about the passing of your father. How readily available is this information when someone embarks on this journey to figure out the truth about vaccines? How deeply hidden, because we know it's hidden, how deeply hidden is it?
Well, thankfully, there are a lot of authors who have already brought up and who have written books about the various dangers from different angles, be it, the neurological injuries or the pertussis vaccine specifically, for instance, or even polio. But anybody who has the time and the interest to go and spend hours in libraries and national archives and knows how to look for certain documents and to make the request to get access to them, I mean, essentially, it's available to anybody. I spent most
Is
of
it
my
hidden
time.
in plain sight? Is that what's going on?
Kind of. I mean, it is still buried in the archives. Like some of the documents I had access to, I only got access to because I made a Freedom of Information request. Otherwise, it would have been closed for 100 years.
Yeah.
And I got access to the documents from 70s and 80s. So I still looking to get access to the documents from the 90s, from 2000, 2010, and Lord knows how long it's going to take before we get all the information on COVID. But it is available. It's just you have to have the patience and the interest to go and look for it. And I did spend about 9 months just in libraries, and what I found, I was quite shocked. That's why, again, I put it in a book format.
Tell us a little bit about the timeline. Maybe you can walk us through several, I'm sure there's more than one or two, several of what you consider the milestone events of what we have come to know as vaccines. Yeah.
Well, it's quite a lot of them. I did point out there is over 1,300 facts in this book about vaccines.
Wow.
The thing that I think stood out to me the most was the first epidemics of diseases like tetanus, for instance. I mean, when I was looking for the first cases of tetanus, it came up as an epidemic following the smallpox vaccination campaign, which for me was just, what? Tetanus after smallpox vaccine? I don't understand why. Same thing with hepatitis B. It wasn't called hepatitis B back in the days. It was called serum hepatitis. But hepatitis B, the first epidemic, again, was recorded following a smallpox vaccination campaign in Germany. Those things quite shocked me because I came from a quite neutral standpoint of vaccines are probably safe and effective as they say they are.
Right.
Even though I had my doubts of the flu vaccine primarily. And then what I did know already, because I'd read a few books, was obviously the 1986 Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Act.
Yeah.
What I didn't know was for instance, the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act in the US, which basically allowed public funds to be used for private interests. So if they want to, say, you've got the NIH who's funding basic taxpayer money, who's funding the development of vaccines in institutions, be it in a university, along with pharmaceutical companies, and then those companies with the public money can go and then patent their inventions, and get royalties off the sales. Now, federal funding is always
this is news to me. So taxpayers fund the research.
Yeah, the Bayh-Dole Act allowed basically federal funding to be used for patented products. Basically, it was supposed to drive innovation in the pharmaceutical industry and trying to encourage new products to come to market. But what it has done in the end is basically, in my opinion, created a huge gold rush of getting products out, having used taxpayer money, and then obviously charging the taxpayer again to purchase the product. So it seems to have accelerated already what started in the 1970s, I would say, with the biotech industry, where they started also to patent the organisms that we're using in pharmaceuticals, and including vaccines, the first of one being the hepatitis B vaccine in 1986, which was the first genetically engineered vaccine on the market that had a patent. That was quite valuable, and it also was developed using some federal funds. As I found out only recently, that basically the federal funding of vaccine development has existed since the 1940s, but it's just very unclear exactly how much and when they were, the vaccines were released. The pneumococcal vaccine, for instance, in the 1970s was supported by federal funding, and then that was one of the most expensive vaccines as well. So was the hepatitis B vaccine when it came out, was one of the most expensive. It's $100, I think, for 3 injections. So, and then obviously there was some of the documents that I came out, as I said, like screaming to fits is a sign of brain damage, which was buried in a document from the Royal Commission on Civil Liability in the UK. So, sorry, I think I veered off and went into the things that shocked me the most without maybe giving you the milestones of what I thought. But I think those for me were the milestones that just basically shocked me in my research and made me want to discover more and to understand better the whole system, because the pharmaceutical industry, we seem to always think is like they're competitors, but you see they make a lot of partnerships, a lot of license exchanges, and will work
Really?
together for developing certain products. And then certain products, like Eli Lilly was a good example of one of the companies that sold off all their vaccine products to different companies, Wyeth, which is now Pfizer, and to some other companies, just because they didn't want to do with the litigation issues that the vaccines had a big problem with in the 1970s and the early 80s, and almost went out of business if it wasn't for the Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. And yeah, that also, it's massive that because there's a 226-year history of vaccinations. Then you factor in the pharmaceutical industry, you factor in the legislation in different countries. And even though Switzerland doesn't have that same legislation, we do have kind of like the same rules and liability given to the pharmaceutical industry, again, under our epidemics law, which is at the moment under a revision to align with the IHR and the pandemic treaty, but that's another story. But anyway.
Is it helpful to think of the pharmaceutical industry as one giant consortium as opposed to competitors, like you just said?
I mean, there's both. They obviously are a giant consortium, and they have their organizations where they're all together, like the European Manufacturers Association, where they'll group together to lobby for their interests in the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. But then they are also competitors to a certain extent, but it's not as clear cut as we would imagine in other industries, for instance, I don't know, the telecom industry or the food industry.
How are things in Europe compared to the US? Because I have it in the back of my mind for the longest time that we are just hopelessly capitalistic here and the almighty dollar rules everything. And I always had it in the back of my mind that Europe was maybe a little bit more mature when it came to that especially when it came to public health. Is that a myth?
I would say that we're maybe a little bit more cautious. The UK especially, surprisingly, not so much Switzerland. I was quite surprised to find out that Switzerland very quickly accepted the vaccines after they were already marketed in the US.
Really?
We don't have the same schedule as the US, but again, it's not a European Union. For instance, the European Union, they have different laws. Like France has different laws from Italy. Italy has just different laws from Belgium, different laws from Germany. Then Switzerland, there are no mandates for any vaccines. There's a lot of social pressure, of course, but there's no mandates for childhood vaccinations in the UK or in Switzerland. There are in France, Italy, Belgium for the polio vaccine, Slovenia. I think Slovenia also does give hepatitis B at birth, but that's probably the main difference between the schedules in Europe and in the US is we don't give hepatitis B at birth. We give it at 2 months.
How significant is the immunity bill that you alluded to a moment ago, where the pharmaceutical companies got immunity, basically could not be sued for any adverse effects from their vaccines? That seems to me like a huge turning point. Is it really?
In the States, absolutely, because on one hand, it guaranteed the vaccine supply would be continued, and I think also incentivized the pharmaceutical industry to come out with a lot more vaccine products, because as you can see from I believe it was from 1983 to 2005, the number of vaccines doubled and the number of mandated vaccines tripled in the US. And that did have kind of a knock-on effect in Europe. I wouldn't know the actual legislation in the UK that protects vaccine manufacturers. But again, once they put in 1979 in the UK, the Vaccine Injury Act, that basically makes the government responsible for paying out damages, not the pharmaceutical industry. And back in the days, it was only £10,000. So that was quite minimal for someone who was completely handicapped, because they had to prove that you were 80% disabled after a vaccine, which we know obviously the burden of proof is on the victims as soon as there is any injury, which makes it very difficult, because especially with the combination vaccines, it's very hard to isolate what vaccine or what antigen actually caused the problem. And in Switzerland, from the 1970s, we had that same kind of liability shield, in the sense it's the taxpayers who pay for any injury. And in Switzerland, it was governed on a state level. But when I tried to dig out to find out how many claims had been compensated, basically it was close to zero, because most people didn't even know it existed.
I was, that leads perfectly into my next question. I think the compensation programs are woefully inadequate. How bad are they?
Well, unfortunately, I would say the one in the US is probably the best that I've actually. Sorry, Japan. Japan has the best vaccine injury compensation program. It seems they actually do let their victims not have such a high burden of proof, and the percentage of cases are actually, I think for COVID vaccines, for instance, something like 80% compensation. In the US, since the beginning of the program, so 1988, there's been over $5 billion paid out to about 11,000 people who have claimed, and this is people who claim, so they actually go to the vaccine injury court. They've already, announced it with VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, and then they get a lawyer to go to vaccine court to actually claim for damages. So you can imagine that's just a small percent of people that are actually injured, because many people, again, don't know the system exists, might not realize in the time frame, because you need to claim in 3 years, I believe. And in Switzerland, it's even harder to get any kind of compensation, because the burden of proof really is on the person who's injured, and you can only get damages for anything that is not covered by health insurance. And here in Switzerland, we have an obligatory health insurance. So if you do have a vaccine injury and you go to hospital and you have to take medication, it's covered by your health insurance. So it's kind of absorbed, if you will. So you can only claim for costs, for instance, like transportation, if you had to go to the hospital or you had to take days off work. But in general, injury is very hard to prove. And in Switzerland, since our new epidemic laws of 2016, we've only ever compensated one person, and that was following COVID vaccine. And that was for a rather measly $12,000. And they didn't specify exactly what the injury was. So we don't know how, handicapped or how damaged this person was. And I've never heard of a death being compensated. In the UK, already 55 claims just relating to COVID deaths have been compensated. And I believe they receive £120,000. And in the US, if you do get a successful claim for a death, it's $250,000. That's the maximum you can get for a death.
How, in your research, I'm going to ask you a very loaded question now. How safe and effective, or unsafe and ineffective, perhaps, as the case may be, are vaccines?
Again, I gotta say, I'm not a medical professional, but in my opinion and based on my research, I don't think any vaccine has passed the bar that we would hope as consumers is being placed to establish safety and efficacy. Again, because efficacy, the only parameter for efficacy is looking at antibodies or T cells. That's the only thing they look at. That's their endpoint, will be looking, can we generate immune response? And for most diseases, we don't even know what the serological, antibody level of protection is. As COVID, we never had it. For pertussis, we don't have it. And so in my opinion, and again, we only look at the immune system. We don't look at anything else. And in the 100 years I have seen of documentation, that seems to be the one thing that hasn't really changed over the years. That we're still looking for antibodies as kind of like the proof that vaccines work, that they're efficacious, because they generate antibodies which protect you against an infection, which it might well do. I mean, the vaccine might well protect you from measles. But I had measles when I was a kid. I was born in the late 70s and remember the measles parties, and that it wasn't serious. And the Brady Bunch, you did an episode on it. Right. It wasn't serious. It was inconvenient for sure, because parents would have to take maybe a week off work. And in some of the first advertisements I saw relating to that, that's what they were trying to sell. They were trying to sell it like, oh, measles is inconvenient. You don't want to have to take a week off work. So let's get the vaccine so you don't get measles. So it might be an efficacious vaccine that it prevents some cases of measles, but that's the only one I could maybe debate. And but honestly, I think in my opinion, the whole science needs to go back to the drawing board, because I did a course at Oxford University, vaccinology course for 1 week, and I had lots of questions they couldn't answer. And one of the main things I always came back to is like, how can you only look at the immune system when you're trying to decide, or trying to assess rather, the safety and the efficacy of a vaccine? Because we know that the immune system doesn't work in isolation from the nervous system, from the endocrine system, from the digestive system. And the fact that we know that neurological injury is one of the most persistent injuries after vaccines, and yet we still haven't done the necessary research to understand why is it creating neurological injuries. For me, if you don't take that into account developing a vaccine, then it's almost like worthless, in my opinion. But again, I'm not a medical expert. I'm just basing this on my research and my humble opinion. But they certainly haven't been proved safe, in my opinion. And that they even admit themselves that the pre-licensure trials are not enough. There's no real placebos. and the post-marketing surveillance is insufficient. It's a passive system. And on top of it, they say that VAERS is not good for in the US, for instance, it's not adequate for establishing causation, which is well true. But they haven't devised a better system in over 40 years since it's been in place.
Yeah, it's the biggest indication that there's an agenda here. You know, I cover a lot of stories that the mainstream narrative, that the nebulous they, like to suppress. And one of the main threads, or one of the main questions that I find myself asking, and I find the people that I work with asking, is, was there ever a time, like for example, in election integrity, I cover that a lot. And the question is, when did this start, the quote unquote stealing of elections? Was there ever a time where vaccines, where the science behind it was pure? Is it just in the last 20 or 30 years, or has our entire life been a lie, basically?
In my opinion, it's been a lie since the beginning. And I'm not saying that people who are involved knew this necessarily. I think a lot of people have very good intentions. Like they really thought they were doing something good. But we have to remember, when vaccines first came out, like smallpox vaccine, we didn't have the science necessary to even look at purity, potency, all those kinds of things were still novel concepts. And bacteriology and immunology only kind of developed in late 1800s, early 20th century. And even then, a lot of it was just kind of experimenting, empirical, let's see what happens, but we don't really know what we're doing. And I don't believe smallpox vaccine is to credit the eradication of smallpox. I mean, you have to think about the hygiene that we had back in the days, lack of sanitation, the living conditions. We didn't have fridges, so obviously you could get like sick from turned milk or turned vegetables, etc. And then, I mean, the one person who stands out as someone maybe who really thought he was doing something great and never wanted a patent on his vaccine was Jonas Salk, who devised the inactive polio vaccine. He really didn't want it to be patented and said it should be free for everybody. So there was no commercial incentive behind his development. And even Morris Hilleman, who is probably the one of the most prolific vaccine developers of all time, who worked for Merck. He also worked for Scripps before that, and I believe also for the military before that. He developed, I think, over 40 vaccines whilst he was working. And he, again, was one of those who tried to sound the alert when they wanted to give hepatitis B at birth, when he was the one who pointed out in an internal memo that maybe we shouldn't be giving newborns, mercury and aluminum. We don't know what the safety profile is of that in a baby, but he was ignored. So I think there were plenty of good people who were in the story of vaccines, so to speak. But I think the story and the history we've been sold is unfortunately very much rewritten by those who have a vested interest in making sure that people continue to get vaccinated.
Is it all about money, Shaz, or is there something more sinister going on here?
I believe it is largely money, but I do believe, unfortunately, there is something sinister, again, do the people know intentionally? Because I do believe, I mean, I don't have children, but one of the reasons why I thought I'm not having kids is all my friends who had kids, they were sick all the time. So what does this do? If you're vaccinating a kid and they get sick, they have asthma, they have ADHD, what are you creating? You're creating a new customer for the pharmaceutical industry. They're going to need antibiotics. They're going to need their inhaler. They're going to need whatever, their Ritalin. It's creating a market of consumers dependent on the pharmaceutical industry to help with the symptoms that they have potentially because of vaccines. Now, this is just my speculation. Obviously, no one's done a study to actually see this, but the people who have done studies between the unvaxxed and vaxxed populations have seen that the vaccinated tend to be less healthy. Hence, they will need the pharmaceutical industry for drugs more often. So yeah, it's money. Yeah, maybe just because sicker people are easier to control. I don't know. I mean, I could go down a very dark, evil rabbit hole if you wanted.
Yeah, right. No, I mean, I don't, and this is why I think having it laid out in timeline form is so effective, because I mean, I was thinking about this the other day in advance of this conversation. Oil, right, becomes a major part of our lives in the Western world in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then the Flexner report comes out in 1910 that basically calls for the modern day pharmaceutical industry. Basically, I mean, in essence, if you distill it, that's what it is. And all of these pharmaceuticals are petroleum based. They're oil based. And you start to connect those dots in your mind. Like you said, it takes you down a very kind of dangerous and scary rabbit hole. But you mentioned at the top, it causes you, timelines cause you to connect dots. Tell us a little bit more about some of those dots that are connected, at least in your mind.
Well, in my mind, yeah, what you brought up about Rockefeller and the fact that he was the owner of of Standard Oil, the first billionaire, and he was the one who was very much behind the reorientation of the medical curriculum. So before the turn of the 20th century, chiropractic, herbal medicine, natural remedies were pretty much accepted as options for medicine, if you will. Sorry.
Yeah.
And thanks to Rockefeller, thanks to his money, because that's basically what allowed him as well to go into these universities, into the schools, and change the curriculum. So it was all pharma-based, basically, pharmaceutical-based, based on his products, of course, because pharmaceuticals are based. And not only the actual products, but I got to, like, packaging. Think about the plastics we use in pharmaceutical packaging.
Great point, yes.
Vaccines. I had a friend once who said he wanted to get out of the pharmaceutical industry because he was just shocked by the amount of plastics that they were using and not recycling. And anyway, sorry, I'm diverging. But
yeah,
that is definitely some of the connections, and some of the other connections that I saw that I really wasn't expecting was what's related to biological weapons. Like realizing that George Merck, who was the director of Merck back in the days, was put in charge of the War Research Service in 1942 to pursue biological warfare and vaccines. And this was at a time when we started developing vaccines after the Second World War. There was a DTaP that came out, and then we had polio, then measles and rubella, and it expanded significantly when the 1986 Childhood Vaccine Injury Act came out. But it helped also see different policies in different countries. For instance, like saying, okay, the UK is maybe 10 years behind the US in certain vaccines and authorizing, like the MMR. It wasn't until 1988 that it was authorized in the UK, when it was available in the US since 1971 and in Switzerland since 1974. So it helped see those kinds of dots, because it's not just vaccine facts that I've added. There's about 2,000 facts as well that are just related to, like, biological warfare, to political unrest, or to what was going on around the world in that time, even slavery laws. Because we have to remember that, again, smallpox vaccine, the time that it came out, kids were working in factories. People forget that we had terrible living and working conditions back in the days, which could have easily caused all these kinds of diseases, which we've credited vaccines as giving us a longer lifespan, when it doesn't seem to be the case when you look at the actual facts.
I'm always weary when what I call narratives start to take hold and you start to hear the same things pushed over and over again. At the height of COVID, we started hearing obviously about the COVID vaccine, but the technology it was based on, it was also began to get pushed. And that's mRNA. I was struck by the fact that every company that put out a COVID vaccine had that vaccine based on mRNA technology. There wasn't a traditional vaccine in the sense that it just had, it made you sick. It kind of introduced the antibodies and it caused you to make antibodies, introduced the virus, caused you to make antibodies, and that was it. It was all about the mRNA. What can you tell us about that?
I just want to clarify that Novavax was a regular protein-based. It wasn't an
Correct.
mRNA vaccine.
Yes.
And Sinovac
Correct.
as well in China, they didn't use mRNA for whatever reason.
Right.
It's very interesting. Moderna, anybody who doesn't realize, Moderna was on the brink of bankruptcy before the COVID pandemic came along, and they could suddenly make use of their mRNA product, which they'd been developing already since like 10 years in collaboration with the Department of Defense and BARDA, primarily on a flu vaccine. But they were able to move that technology pretty quickly thanks to the emergency use authorization. But it was interesting, the first clinical trial that was ever on humans using mRNA for an infectious disease. But before it was more developed researched in the context of cancer therapy, so very individualized. But in the context of special infectious diseases, the first trial occurred in 2013, and that was in CureVac in Germany, which was also another company financed by Bill and Melinda Gates. What a surprise!
Right.
But it wasn't very successful. Like, it was only on 100 patients, and it was to check the administration route. oral and injected, and they realized that the oral version actually was much more effective than the injected. And this is 2013, so we by far not really well advanced on the technology itself, especially for infectious diseases, and especially for everybody. I mean, mRNA was known to be problematic, especially the nanolipid particles, which obviously helped the mRNA get back into this, well, get into the cells, not get back into the cells, or get into the cells, but on its own is understood to be quite a potent adjuvant. So on its own can induce an immune reaction. Now, why would you want to be giving something you know that's going to create an immune reaction, create inflammation, systemic inflammation in people who have no risk of developing serious COVID, or even pregnant women? I mean, for me, that really got me, that we're now recommending 4 vaccines for pregnant women. So DTP, COVID, mRNA technology, RSV, and the flu vaccine. And mRNA, what the good advantage for the pharmaceutical companies, it's much cheaper to produce. And now they're even talking about self-amplifying, self-trans-amplifying mRNA, where basically it creates itself when it's in the body. So it's even cheaper to manufacture because they even need less of the raw material because it reproduces in your body. But again, there's no understanding. Very little understanding of how long it lasts. How long does it actually keep generating mRNA? And you got to remember there's like about 9 steps in between the actual injection and supposed to be inducing an immune response, which is supposed to be protective. And that's a lot of assumptions on the way to just assuming that it's going to work the same way in everybody, which we know that no product, especially a medical product, is not going to react in the same 10 people in the same way. In 10 different people in the same way.
I mean, that blanket, I think that's an excellent point. That blanket claim that no matter how old you were, what gender you were, what health condition you were, it was all going to be just as effective. I think that was the biggest indication that something was amiss here. We have a couple of minutes left. I want you to tell the folks a little bit more about the book and where they can find it and what they can expect to learn when they read it.
So my book is called The Ultimate Vaccine Timeline. You can buy it obviously on Amazon. You can see on your screen, Barnes and Nobles. I'm also for supporting your local bookstore. If you have one, get them to order it in. And then I have a website that's going to come on live on the 4th of August, which is called theultimatevaccinetimeline.com. So all in one word. And on there, I will put not all the references, because as I said, there's over 3,000 references. I will put as much information as I can, complimentary information, new information, because I'm still researching and still finding new information that is worthy of sharing, like the evolution of prices in more detail. And then for anyone who is interested, there is also a contents page on the website for the moment until the website is live. So you can see exactly what's in the contents. And then anybody who wants to look, they can see that that's it's very dense, but there's lots of images. I've got plenty of like product catalogs from 1910. You can see we had a vaccine against hay fever back in the days. And then information like a summary reports of the Institute of Medicine reports, historical publications highlighting vaccine concerns already from like the late 1800s. Then the timeline on the pharmaceutical manufacturers, so that can show you so you can follow. Basically, I started with the pharmaceutical industry because I found it really hard to follow, who owned what vaccine company now, and like Wyeth went out of business, who do they sell to, and then Sanofi, who have they bought up, because they have massive portfolios now. The 4 giants, the GSK, Pfizer, Merck, and Sanofi.
Is there a lot of that as well? Buyouts and mergers and the like?
Yeah, they're really busy. Yep, absolutely. Especially just before the Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, because as I said, a lot of manufacturers were going out of business because of litigation. So Eli Lilly, for instance, sold off their vaccine portfolio. Some others, like Dow Chemicals, I didn't know they made vaccines, but they just stopped making vaccines. Novartis had a whole vaccine portfolio they sold to GSK. It's that's why I started actually with them, because I just wanted to track who's doing what and who bought what. So
it's uncanny, because again, I mentioned a little earlier about the election integrity, and when you follow the story of the voting machine manufacturers, it's exactly the same way. It's a labyrinth. Who owns what, and they're constantly selling out to each other, and they're partnering with each other, and it's all designed to obfuscate, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, no, I think it is to make it very confusing and hard for people to follow what's going on, so people will give up. Or, you have to be pretty stubborn to really want to go and understand it to the bottom. Like, okay. So, but yeah, it's convoluted, and I think it's designed that way on purpose, as you said. For the elections, I have no idea, but definitely with regards to the pharmaceutical industry and with regards to some of the vaccine information, that they would confuse us. And so yeah.
Well, I think this is a very, very worthy endeavor, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much for taking the time and staying up a little late. I know you're based in Switzerland, so you're a good 5 or 6 hours ahead of us on the East Coast in the U.S. here. But I hope to have you back because this is a very, very important topic, and I think that these 30 minutes have kind of flown by, and I think we're just scratching the surface here. So, so I'd love to have you back for a future conversation.
With pleasure. Thank you, Mike, for your time. And yeah, I'd love to come back because for sure you could talk for hours about the subject. It's so vast.
It's all worthy information. It was great to meet you, Shaz.
Great to meet you, Mike. Have a lovely day.
You too.